Will you say I'm mad? The disease sharpened my senses. It did not destroy them. And I have heard all things in heaven and on the earth. I heard many things in hell. Am I mad? See how calmly I tell the whole story.
It's impossible to say how the idea first entered my brain. It haunted me night and day. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye. Whenever it looked at me, my blood ran cold, and very gradually I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and rid myself of the eye forever. You think I'm mad? Madmen know nothing. You should have seen how wisely I went about it, how cautiously. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. Every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it very gently. I made sure that no light shone from my lantern. I moved it slowly, very slowly, so not to disturb the old man's sleep.
Would a madman have been so wise?
I shone the lantern cautiously so that a single beam fell on the vulture eye. I did this for 7 long nights. Every night, just at midnight.
I found the eye was always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man I hated, but his evil eye.
Every morning I went into his chamber and asked how he had passed the night. So you see, he would never suspect that every night at 12, I looked in on him while he slept. On the 8th night, I was more than careful, opening the door.
To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even dreaming of my secret deeds and thoughts. I chuckled at the idea.
Perhaps he heard me. He moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. My thumb slipped on the lantern, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I didn't move, not a muscle. Then I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror.
I knew the sound well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him. I knew that he'd been lying awake ever since the first slight sound. His fears had been growing on him. He had been saying to himself, it's nothing but the wind in the chimney. It's only a mouse crossing the floor. But it was death approaching him.
When I had waited a very long time without hearing him lie down, I shone the lantern on him, and it fell upon that vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious.
There came to my ears a low, dull sound, the sound of clock legs all wrapped up in cotton. I knew that sound. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury.
I held the lantern motionless. The hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, louder and louder. And at that dead hour of the night, that strange noise excited me to uncontrollable terror. The beating grew louder, louder. I thought the heart must burst. The old man's hour had come. I leaped into the room. He shrieked once, only once. I dragged him to the floor. The deed was done. But for many moments, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. It stopped. The old man was dead. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more.
If you still think me mad, you'll think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took to conceal the body.
I took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and put the body inside the floor. Then I replaced the board so cleverly that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. It was 4 in the morning when I was finished, still as dark as midnight. There came knocking on the street door. I opened the door. What had I to fear? 3 men entered. Police officers. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night. I smiled. What had I to fear? I made them welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man was gone to the country, and I took them all over the house to search well. I took them to the old man's chamber. I showed them his gold and treasure, all secure, and I brought chairs into the room and asked them to rest. They were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. They sat, and I answered questions.
I thought I heard a ringing in my ears, and I wished them gone. The ringing became more distinct. It became very definite. And then I found the noise was not inside my ears. I talked to the police, but the sound increased. There was a low, dull, quick sound, and yet the officers didn't hear it. I talked more quickly, but the noise increased. Why wouldn't they go? I paced the floor with heavy steps, but the noise increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I raved, I swore, I grated the chair on the floor, but the sound increased. It grew louder, louder, and still the police chatted pleasantly. Was it possible they hadn't heard? No. They heard. They suspected. They knew. I had to scream or die. The sound was louder, louder, louder. I admit the deed. Turn up the planks. Here it is. The beating of his hideous heart.
Listen to the wind. I should hardly think he'd come tonight. That's the worst of living so far out. Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. There he is. The old man rose as a tall, burly man entered. "Sergeant Major Morris," said Mr. White, introducing him to his wife and his son Herbert. The little family gathered chairs by the fire, regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts who spoke of wild deeds, of wars and plagues and strange people. "I'd like to go to India myself," the old man spoke. "Better where you are," replied Sergeant Major Morris. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps. To look at it," he said, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy. But it has a spell put on it by an old fakir, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their own sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" "I have." "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" "I did." "And has anybody else wished?" "The first man had his 3 wishes. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." "If you could have another 3 wishes, would you have them?" "I don't know." He took the paw, and dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "If you don't want it, Morris, give it to me." "No. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, it's your own doing. Don't blame me for what happens." Mr. White shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it? How do you wish with it?" "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, but I warn you, only evil will come of it. I must be off now. But remember, if you must wish, wish for something sensible." Mr. White held the paw in his right hand. "I don't know what to wish for. It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only clear the mortgage on the house, you'd be quite happy." "Well, wish for $200 then." "That'll just do it," said Herbert. His father held up the talisman as the son sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for $200. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved. I wished, and it twisted in my hand like a snake. "Well, I don't see the money. It must have been your imagination, Father," replied his son. The old man shivered, as if it were cold. Even after his wife and son went off to bed, he sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, then he put it down, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. "Well, don't spend those $200 before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table to go to work. "That monkey's paw may turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." He laughed, and his mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home." "I dare say, but for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to you." "You thought it did." The old man and his wife argued about it all morning. I say it did. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside who was looking at the house in an undecided fashion. He paused at the gate, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. I was asked to call. I come from the factory. Is anything the matter? Has anything happened to Herbert? I'm sorry. Is he hurt? Badly hurt. But he's not in any pain. Oh, thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. He was caught in the machinery. Mr. White stared blankly out of the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days, nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us. It's hard to believe he's dead. The factory wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your loss. I was to say that they admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White gazed with horror. How much? $200. A week had passed since the old people had buried their son. Mr. White dozed fitfully until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. The paw! The monkey's paw! Where is it? What's the matter? I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Think of what? The other two wishes. We only had one. Get it quickly. And wish, oh, my boy, my boy. But he has been dead 10 days, and besides, I could not tell you, but after the accident, I could recognize him only by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now? Bring him back. Do you think I fear the child I have nursed? Wish. He raised his hand and held the monkey's paw. I wish my son alive again. What's that? It's Herbert. Let go. I must open the door. For God's sake, don't let it in. You're afraid of your own son. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her, appealing to her to stop as she hurried downstairs. He heard the door chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. He was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the monkey's paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside that had been his son got in. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The street lamp flickering opposite shone upon a quiet and deserted road.
A long time ago in Japan, there lived a poor farmer and his wife. They had a number of children and found it hard to feed them all. The elder son was strong enough to help his father, and the little girls learned to help their mother. But the youngest son did not seem fit for hard work. He was very clever, but quite weak and small for his age. So his parents thought it would be better for him to become a priest rather than a farmer. They took him to the village temple and asked the priest who lived there if he would teach him all that a priest ought to know. The old man spoke kindly to the boy and asked him some hard questions. So clever were the answers that the priest agreed to educate him for the priesthood. The boy learned quickly and was very obedient in most things. But he had one fault. He liked to draw cats during his study hours, and to draw cats even where cats ought not to have been drawn at all. He drew them on the margins of the priest's books, and on the screens of the temple, and on the walls. Several times the priest told him that this was not right, but he could not stop drawing cats. One day, after he had drawn some very clever pictures of cats upon a paper screen, the old priest said to him, "My boy, you must go away from this temple at once. You will never make a good priest, but perhaps you will become a great artist. Let me give you this advice, and be sure that you never forget it. Avoid large places at night. Keep to small." The boy did not know what the priest meant by those words, but he tied up his possessions into a small bundle and left the temple. He began to wonder what he should do. If he went home, he felt sure that his father would punish him for being disobedient to the priest. And then he remembered that in the next village there was a very big temple with many priests. So he decided to go there and ask them to educate him for the priesthood. Now the big temple was closed, but the boy did not know this. A goblin had frightened the priests away and had taken possession of the place. Brave warriors had gone to the temple at night to kill the goblin, but they had never been seen again. When the boy got to the village, it was already dark, and all the people were in bed. But he saw the big temple on a hill, and he saw there was a light in the temple. The villagers said that the goblin made that light in order to tempt lonely travelers to ask for shelter. The boy walked up to the temple door and knocked. There was no sound inside. He knocked again and again, and at last pushed gently on the door, which opened. So he went in and saw the lamp burning. He sat down and waited for some priest to come. He noticed that everything in the temple was covered with dust and thickly spun over with cobwebs. So he thought to himself that the priest would certainly like to have an apprentice to keep the place clean. What pleased him most, however, were some big white screens, good to paint cats upon. Though he was tired, he took out his ink and his paints and began to paint cats upon the screens. He painted for a long time, and then he began to feel very sleepy. He was just on the point of lying down beside one of the screens when he remembered the old priest's words. Avoid large places at night. Keep to small. The temple was very large, but he was all alone, and as he thought of these words, though he did not understand them, he began to feel afraid. And so he decided to look for a small place in which to sleep. He found a little cabinet with a sliding door, and he crawled in and fell fast asleep. Sometime later that night, he was awakened by a most terrible noise. A noise of fighting and screaming. It was so dreadful that he was afraid to open the cabinet door to take a look. He lay very still, holding his breath. The awful sounds continued, and the temple shook. And finally it became silent. But the boy was still afraid to move. He did not move until the light of the morning sun shone into the cabinet through a chink in the sliding door. He got out of his hiding place very cautiously and looked about. The first thing he saw was that all the floor of the temple was covered with blood. And then he saw, lying dead in the middle of it, an enormous, monstrous rat. A goblin rat, bigger than a cow. But who or what had killed it? Suddenly the boy saw that the mouths of the cats he had drawn the night before were red and wet with blood. And then he knew that the goblin had been killed by the cats which he had drawn. And then also, for the first time, he understood why the wise old priest had said to him, "Avoid large places at night. Keep the small." Afterward, the boy became a very famous artist, drawing cats.
Mr. Nuttall was a very nervous man. He'd been undergoing treatment for several years now, and as he had an independent income and no need to work, he spent most of his time visiting friends and relatives. Before his nervous condition had come about, he had been almost a total recluse, spending his time reading a large number of books. As a consequence, his visit to relatives consisted of meeting a large number of comparative strangers. It was nearly fall of the year when he knocked on the door of the Sappleton residence. He was ushered in by a very dignified 10-year-old girl, who asked him to have a seat and told him that her aunt would be down shortly. She sat for a moment, glancing at a strangely bound book, and then, looking up, said, "Do you know many people around here?" "Hardly a soul," said Mr. Nuttall. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," said the girl. Mr. Nuttall admitted that he knew of her as a relative and her name and address. The young girl smiled sympathetically. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago." "Tragedy?" inquired the nervous Mr. Nuttall. The girl pointed to the French windows leading to the lawn. "You may wonder why we keep them open on an October afternoon." "Well, it is quite warm for this time of the year," replied Mr. Nuttall. "But has that window got anything to do with your aunt's tragedy?" "Oh, yes," said the girl. "Out through that window 3 years ago today, her husband and her 2 younger brothers went off for a day's hunting. They never came back. While crossing the moor to their favorite ground, they were all swallowed up in a treacherous piece of quicksand. Their bodies were never recovered. But that was the dreadful part of it. My poor aunt always thinks they will come back someday. They and the little brown dog that was lost with them will walk in that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening until nightfall. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white raincoat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing "Do You Ken John Peel," as he always did, to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. You know, on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get the creepy feeling that they will walk in that window. Mr. Nuttall shuddered, and was quite relieved when the aunt came into the room with a burst of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She's been very interesting," said Mr. Nuttall, glancing in the direction of the open window. The long shadows of the late afternoon made the distant trees even gloomier, he thought. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said the aunt in a brisk voice. "My husband and brothers will be home shortly from hunting, and they always come in this way. They've been out in the marshland, so they'll make a fine mess on my carpets, just like you menfolk." She rattled on cheerfully about the hunting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects of duck in the winter. To Mr. Nuttall, it was all horrible. He made a topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying to the open window. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest and an absence of mental excitement. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement," said Mr. Nuttall, trying to capture the conversation. "No," said the aunt, yawning. And then she suddenly brightened into alert attention. Mr. Nuttall shivered slightly and turned to the little girl to give her a look of sympathy. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Mr. Nuttall swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. There, in the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one carried a muddy white raincoat. A tired brown spaniel was at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then Mr. Nuttall heard,
"Do ye ken John Peel with his coat so grey? Do ye ken John Peel at the break of day? Do ye ken John Peel when he's far away? With a fox..."
Mr. Nuttall grabbed his coat and headed for the front door. Flinging it open, he ran down the path, tried to jump the hedges, tripped and fell down. Picking himself up, he gave a terrified glance back at the house and ran down the road toward the railroad station. Back in the house, the figure carrying the muddy raincoat stepped in the open window and said, "We're home, dear. A bit muddy, but in time for supper. Who was that ran out as we came up to the house?" "Oh, that was Mr. Nuttall, dear," said the aunt. "Some distant relative that dropped in for a visit. Extraordinary man. All he seemed to talk about was his illness, and when he saw you coming, dashed off without saying a word. I don't know what to make of it." The little girl shook her head gravely and said, "I expect it was the spaniel. Mr. Nuttall has a horror of dogs. He was telling me just before you came down that once he was chased into a cemetery by a pack of wild dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling, grinning, and foaming just above him." "Oh, why, the poor man," said her aunt. "One would have thought that he had seen a ghost." The little girl smiled sweetly.